Today we're talking about the new Specialized 3.1 motor, and we're doing a super deep dive. Of course, we'll be discussing our dyno testing results, real-world impressions, feature set, the sound profile, connectivity, batteries and chargers, everything you need to know about the drive system of the new Levo Gen 4 right after the intro. In this video, we're focusing exclusively on the Specialized 3.1 drive system. If you're interested in the bike itself, the new Levo Gen 4, which was also just introduced, then I'd refer you to the video on our German main channel. That's not what today is about, because we have quite a lot to talk about. So I'd say, without much further ado, let's dive right in and start by talking about the general technical specifications of the new drive system. Let's answer one of the most burning questions. Yes, once again, Specialized is using hardware from Brose for the new 3.1 motor. In contrast to its predecessor, they've also made several changes to the hardware itself. So much like before, they put their own spin on it through sensors, software, display, connectivity, batteries, and now even through modifications to the motor itself. I know I had already said this about the 2.2 version, that it deserved to have the Specialized logo on it instead of Brose, because it really was its own drive system. However, that's even more true now with the new Specialized 3.1. But what are we even talking about? The motor itself comes in two different, versions or variants. I'm not exactly sure what to call them. So the hardware, the motor itself, is actually always the same. However, there are two different performance variants. There's an S-Works motor that delivers an impressive 111 Newton meters of maximum torque and up to 720 watts of peak power. And all the others, meaning all models besides the S-Works, come with the standard, slightly less powerful version. That one has a peak power of 666 watts and 101 Newton meters of torque. But in this video, we're talking almost exclusively about the S-Works version. That's simply because it's the only one I've ridden and also the one we did our dyno testing with. I've already asked Specialized if we can get another model with the standard motor at a later time. Still, if I had to draw conclusions based on the technical specs, as there is only about a 50-watt difference in power and 10 Newton meters in torque, I honestly wouldn't expect the real-world differences to be all that drastic between the two different versions. It's done via software, so how Specialized will handle that in the future, whether it might be possible to update your standard motor to the S-Works variant for an upcharge or something like that, I just don't know right now. And with that, I would also wrap up the topic of the two different motor variants for now. As I said, the hardware is the same anyway. By the way, the motor itself weighs 3.2 kilos. That means it's actually gotten a bit heavier. Compared to the previous model, that's about 300 grams more. The internal drive belt is completely gone. Given that it was both a blessing and a curse, people might be torn on that decision. Now they're using steel gears on the inside similar to other motors. They've been stressing when talking to us that there is zero plastic used on the inside of the motor. Additionally, those gears also feature a very special coating called DLC. That's one of the hardware changes that Specialized made compared to the standard Brose motor. The coating is supposed to make the sound profile more consistent. DLC stands for diamond-like coating and is basically wear-free. The coating reduces the resistance between the gears and by that makes it possible to use thinner oil in the gearbox. Specialized claims that this results in a very consistent noise profile of the motor, no matter if it's already heated up or still completely cool. That's in contrast to the predecessor that had the tendency to get quite a bit louder when it heated up. The same is true for most Bosch motors, by the way. When it comes to the batteries, there are 3 different or 2.5 different variants. We have an 840 watt-hour battery, which comes standard in all models of the Levo Gen 4. There is also an optional 600 watt-hour battery and a 280 watt-hour range extender. We'll talk about the battery topic again later. For now, we're diving deep into the topic of the motor, specifically into our extensive dyno testing with the Levo Gen 4. Let's jump straight into the numbers. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover. First of all, once again, let's look at the maximum power output. We determine that, just to clarify, at an input power of 250 watts at the crank with a cadence of 75 to 80, and then we determine the mechanical output of the motor. That means first we measure the total power at the rear wheel. Of course, that includes the input power. So we subtract that at the end to get the pure mechanical motor output. And for the new specialized 3.1 motor, in this S-Works version as mentioned, it falls, let's call it, in the upper mid-range. We're looking at around 650 watts of maximum mechanical power output. That is below the 720 watts that Specialized claims, which could be due to various reasons. It might be due to our measurement methodology. It could also be that what Specialized states is the electrical power. That means the power that the motor draws from the battery during operation. And of course, in this whole system, from the electronics to the mechanics, meaning all the way to the chain, there are substantial power losses. So in the end, less reaches the ground. That's the same with all drive systems. Just take a look at the table we have here, the performance table, and compare it to the power outputs in the respective manufacturer's specifications. You'll see that we're below those figures across the board. So with the 650 watts, as mentioned, we're in the upper mid-range. We're above a Shimano EP801, above a Bosch CX Gen 5, and so on. We're also above the previous 2.2 version of the motor quite significantly. However, the Specialized 3.1 isn't as powerful as the DJI Avinox. It's not even remotely close. When it comes to raw, pure power, that motor is still in a league of its own. Additionally, we also measured the performance at 100 watts, which more closely reflects typical touring riding. Here the motor falls within the usual range, but even at 100 watts in the highest support level, it delivers a solid amount of power, even though its predecessor was actually a little bit more powerful in this scenario. Now we're going to break that down in a bit more detail and take a closer look at the first of several different curves we recorded. Specifically our power curve here. This essentially shows the ratio of the input power to the motor's output power. In other words, it demonstrates how much power the motor puts out depending on how hard you pedal. Like always, we'll start with the highest support level. We also looked at different scenarios, which I'll get to later. In the highest support level, the characteristic is pretty typical. The motor is relatively progressive, meaning that with relatively little input power, you don't get a huge amount of output in return just yet. But then it increases significantly and peaks at around 650 watts of output power. You reach that in turbo mode with about 170 watts of input at the crank. That means you need to put in 170 watts to get approximately 650 watts out. We recorded the curve at a constant cadence of 75 to 80. It always fluctuates a bit, I think, for this motor. It averaged around 77. But of course, it's also interesting to see how the motor behaves at different cadences. And we looked into that in detail as well and recorded the cadence spectrum. Here, we're not going for maximum power and are putting only 130 watts into the crank. We're doing this because we want to simulate a scenario that's a bit closer to real-world conditions, and here we can see that the curve is actually quite interesting. For one thing, compared directly to the 2.2 motor, we see a significantly more stable cadence curve. That means a very predictable behavior, somewhat reminiscent of Bosch, for example. We've already pretty much hit the sweet spot at a cadence of about 60 with very small gains beyond that, which means you don't have to pedal super fast to already get a lot of power out of it. Then the power increases slowly and steadily in a kind of parabolic shape up to a cadence of about 100 before decreasing again slightly. So we don't have a sharp drop in power at higher cadences here, like we do, for example, with the Shimano EP801, but rather a slight decrease in power. We also pushed the motor further and saw that the output stays consistent until a cadence of about 135. And then it drops off sharply. You don't see that in the curve now, but we really wanted to push the motor to its limits and saw that it handles very high cadences well. And thanks to this forgiving profile, this fairly consistent power output, it's a motor that's intuitive to ride. I had already mentioned that in other tests for drive units we've done, I always draw two main conclusions from this cadence curve. One is, of course, where the sweet spot is, how the power is delivered, but also how intuitively it can be ridden. Because if you have very different power delivery depending on the cadence, it's a motor that takes a long time to get used to, especially if you're riding uphill on technical terrain, for example. It takes a long time to get used to a motor that, for example, delivers completely different power at a cadence of 60 compared to 100 or 120. If the power output remains as consistent as possible here, then it's a motor you can get used to very quickly. And one that is also very intuitive to ride. And that is definitely the case here. You can even go a step further. You can influence this cadence curve and also the slight drop in power at higher cadences if you really want completely consistent power output. And that's through the shuttle mode. But we'll talk more about that later in the video once we've covered the basics and go into detail then. Just something to keep in mind for now. The next thing we're going to look at now is the topic of derating, or you could also call it thermal stability. In other words, how does the motor behave under prolonged continuous load? Does it have issues with heat management? Do we experience significant power drops and so on and so forth? We actually put a lot of thought into this beforehand because the topic really gained more attention with the DJI Avinox. Also because back then we let the motor run until it actually shut down. That later improved with software updates and so on, also depending on the battery size, but that's not what we want to focus on now. However, afterwards we started to wonder whether the approach is actually relevant in real-world use at all, or rather, how long is such a continuous load scenario really relevant in practice? And at what point does it just become about making big headlines? Because if a motor shuts off after 40 minutes of continuously delivering maximum power, that's simply not relevant for the real world. I've emphasized that already in our video about the Avinox drive system. So we've now decided that we will use a 15-minute time window as the benchmark for this continuous load scenario. That means continuous load at 250 watts of input power. That really means without stopping even for a single second. 15 minutes of continuously putting 250 watts on the crank. It's a lot, and it's already borderline in terms of what a well-trained mountain biker can handle. Additionally, you have to take the terrain into account because as soon as there's even a short downhill section, the motor can already recover. So it's quite a, let's call it, worst-case scenario. After our benchmark time window of 15 minutes, we let the test run for an additional 5 minutes. We're doing this because from our experience, that's when most motors reach their thermal limit. We want to observe their derating behavior, whether the motors shut down completely, whether they significantly reduce power. Now let's take a look at the new Specialized 3.1 motor. In our 15-minute test, it's pretty much flawless. Even better than its predecessor, which was already very good. Better than Bosch, both Gen 5 and Gen 4, and roughly on the same level, for example, with the Pinion MGU, which is significantly larger and has more mass to dissipate heat. The Avinox, which I already talked about earlier, has a very unique derating behavior and fluctuates a lot right from the start. We don't see that with the Specialized 3.1. It's very consistent. Yes, it does lose a bit of power over those 15 minutes, and by the end, we're still at around 95% power after 15 minutes. Looking at our extended window is a bit less favorable for the Specialized 3.1 because after around 15 to 16 minutes, it enters the derating range and significantly reduces its power. It drops sharply to about 75% of its power, which, however, is within the range of what we actually see with many other drive systems as well. And I can add this now as well. We'll come back to it later during the energy consumption measurements. It's a very controlled derating behavior. I would argue that it's not reaching its thermal limit here, but rather it's more of a preventive measure because it consistently maintains that 75%. It doesn't fluctuate anymore either. It stays very steady and very solid. So all in all, the derating behavior is very good. It's excellent for our 15-minute test and still pretty good for our extended window of 20 minutes, despite reducing power by that point. And as I said, especially at the 20-minute mark, we're entering a range that's really borderline. So it has to be very hot, you have to be very fit, and you need to be riding the right kind of mountain. Then it's possible that you might enter that range where it reduces power significantly, but that will truly be an absolute exception. To give you a bit of a better comparison between different drive systems in terms of thermal stability, we also thought we'd create another bar chart. We're showing the average power output of the drive systems over this time window of 15 minutes. In addition, we also show the lowest power output that we measured during that time period. This way, you can get a bit of a sense of how the different drive systems behave over this benchmark window we've defined. So just for you, this is something you'll actually see more often in future tests. Next up is energy consumption. And here too, I stand by what I've said in previous videos. We're no longer going to give you any specific numbers when it comes to watt-hours per kilometer for different motors. As helpful as that might seem to you at first glance, it will not be relevant for a lot of real-world scenarios. Energy consumption depends on so many other factors, like the tires, your riding style, the terrain, and the surface. There are so many factors that influence energy consumption that I honestly no longer feel comfortable giving you any hard numbers here and saying, this drive system uses less energy than that one. It's just very difficult to measure, and basically it always comes down to one very simple rule. The drive system that delivers more power offers higher assistance, and where you get more support will give you less range overall. However, we still drain the 840 watt-hour battery in the Levo Gen 4 on our dyno from 100 to 0%. We did that mainly to observe the power output at different states of charge of the battery. We also wanted to look at the behavior of the drive system with a nearly empty battery. What we found is pretty remarkable and might also be connected to the high operating voltage. As our test simulates a gradient of 10% and runs for over an hour, we obviously saw some slight thermal derating, as is expected for such an extensive test scenario and typical for any e-bike motor, and ultimately nothing to worry about. However, apart from that, we couldn't observe any decrease in power depending on the battery's state of charge. Usually that's a major factor. When its state of charge drops, the individual cells no longer deliver as much voltage. That means the system voltage drops and the motor can no longer deliver the same power. For example, with only 10% battery left, it can't deliver the same power as it could with a full battery. At least that's the case with most other systems. However, the specialized 3.1 drive unit only show a tiny drop in power over the course of the test. What's really interesting here is that even with just 1% battery left, we still had almost maximum power. However, you should be aware that once the battery drops to 0%, the motor shuts off immediately. If you're not used to that, it might catch you off guard. You got full power until you have no power at all. Sure, the drive system still works then. There's a buffer for things like lights or the directly attached rear derailleur, but the assistance really cuts out abruptly. And then you're left there and you have to pedal a bit harder. Next, we'll take a look at the motor's cutoff curve. That means, how does it behave when you approach the speed limit of your region? How does the motor fade out? How natural does it feel? And how long can you actually ride with full assistance? Our findings are pretty interesting because, at least for our EU version of the bike, Specialized really pushes the legal limits. The assistance continues for quite a long time. Even over our legal limit of 25 kilometers per hour, there's still full support. Obviously, it starts to fade out after that. The reduction of power is very smooth and feels pretty natural when you push the bike over its speed limit. It's very similar to what we saw from the DJI Avinox. Last but not least, before we talk about the batteries and especially the chargers, we also conducted a few additional measurements, as I had already mentioned, because with the specialized system, you can adjust the motor tune to your liking. Additionally, you have new support levels that are worth taking a look at. We'll start by sticking with the topic of support levels. Here we have the familiar Eco, Trail, and Turbo modes. These are the three standard support levels, and a new addition is the Auto support mode. It works similarly to the Auto support mode found, for example, on the DJI Avinox. In this mode, the support power is dynamically adjusted depending on the gradient and other factors like how you pedal, cadence, and so on. So, as the name suggests, it's basically the automatic mode that combines everything into one. For practical and time-related reasons, we didn't conduct any measurements on this. It felt good out on the trail, but I didn't ride it for very long because it was relatively new on this test bike. On the other test bike that I was able to ride over a longer period, the auto support mode wasn't installed yet. So that means I don't have any detailed hands-on experience with it. For those of you who might already be riding a Levo in a few weeks when this video has been online for a while, feel free to share your experience with the auto mode with others down below in the comments. So those are the four standard support levels, but what I also want to touch on is the so-called micro-tune. Specialized riders are already familiar with it. It was already available on other e-bikes and e-mountain bikes from Specialized in the past. You can enter a special support mode using the remote on the handlebar, and up until now, microtune meant you were able to adjust the support in 10% increments. With the new specialized 3.1 motor and the Levo Gen 4, you can now choose a dynamic microtune as well. And for me, I think I would definitely go as far as to say it's a real game changer for my style of riding, because this dynamic microtune works as follows. You still have 10 levels of support that you can adjust directly via your remote. But in each of these 10 levels, you always have the ability to reach 100% maximum power. And through these 10 levels, you adjust the drive system's progressiveness. That means how much power you have to put on your pedals to reach the maximum power output. So for example, the display might show 10 out of 100, which is the lowest level. And that means you have to pedal really hard to get the full 100% power. You can go all the way up to 100 out of 100. That's the normal turbo mode, which means you have to pedal very little. And the fact that you can adjust this while riding without an app, without anything directly, is great. To visualize the behavior of the motor in different modes, we did power measurements with settings of 30, 100 and 70, 100 compared to regular turbo. By the way, the lowest setting corresponds pretty closely with the regular trail assistance mode. As you can see in the graph, the progressiveness of the power output is influenced quite heavily, and the riding feel changes drastically. Even in the 30-100 setting, you already have to pedal really hard to get the maximum power output. You need to put down something between 300 and 400 watts of power to get the full assistance. It's amazing to be able to change this behavior while riding on the fly by a push of a button from your handlebar. After getting familiar with it, I rode the bike almost exclusively in this dynamic microtune mode. Next, we looked at another specialized specific feature, the shuttle mode. It's nothing new, but we nevertheless wanted to conduct some measurements to see its effects on power output. Shuttle mode, as the name suggests, is designed to let you shuttle to the trailhead with minimal effort. It's essentially a lift assist mode. And Specialized says you simply don't have to pedal as hard to get the most assistance from the motor. For example, that means you can ride in easier gears without pushing too hard, maybe after a long day of riding for a last descent. Of course, the motor uses more energy when you do that, and you get less range. As Specialized is a bit vague on the exact effects of the shuttle mode, we put it to the test. You can set the shuttle mode in 3 or rather 4 different settings. You can turn it off, that's the default setting, and then there are low, medium, and high. We went ahead and set it to high and recorded the cadence curve. We did that because Specialized specifically mentions cadence in their description of shuttle mode. And here we can see, for example, that compared to the regular cadence curve, both measured in turbo assistance level, by the way, you already get significantly more power across the entire range from very low to very high cadence. So the support factor of the motor is much higher when you turn on shuttle mode. That's also pretty cool for those who think that even regular turbo could be more powerful. And we also see that the motor remains a bit more stable at higher cadences. So although there's a slight drop after its sweet spot at around a cadence of 100, it's not quite as pronounced as we see in the regular mode. Here it stays almost constant, even up to a cadence of 125. So I personally found that quite interesting as well. It really shows what the shuttle mode actually does, because for me it was always a bit of a mystery, like a little black box, how this shuttle mode actually works in practice and also how it affects things in theory. That's it for now on the topic of the motor and our dyno testing. We'll come back to the topic later when we talk about real-world use, noise levels and so on. But first, let's talk about the batteries. As I mentioned, we have 3 different variants. There's an 840 watt-hours battery, a 600 watt-hours, and the 280 watt-hours range extender. The 2 main batteries, which are located in the down tube, can now, for the first time for Specialized, be conveniently removed from the side. Let me grab the 840 watt-hours battery. This is what it looks like. It's housed in a really solid aluminum casing. And by the way, it's also IP67 waterproof, so it's very well sealed for a battery. However, it's also very heavy. So with the 840 watt-hours battery, we're looking at a weight of about 4.4 kilos. When I weighed it, it came out to 4.39 kilos exactly. And that makes it significantly heavier than, for example, the new Bosch PowerTube 800, or heavier than the 800 watt-hours variant for the Avanox system. Sure, it also has a bit more capacity than those two. I've got it here now so you can also see the size comparison. Specialized even takes it a step further here than Bosch. They have already gotten a bit thicker with the new batteries compared to the old ones. Specialized goes one step further and makes the thing quite bulky, but in return it's relatively short. Of course, that means the down tube of the new Levo is relatively thick. That's the trade-off they went for, as people had complained about the very long battery of the older Levo. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the 600 watt-hours battery in person yet. I've only seen pictures and looked at the dimensions. It's quite a bit shorter, but has the same diameter and has something like an adapter on top. So it's plug and play. You can swap it out directly. You don't need to modify anything. It uses the same mount. Specialized told us repeatedly that the modularity of the battery system was an important aspect when developing the new system. That means you can combine everything with everything else, and you can also ride with any component on its own. That applies to the range extender as well. As mentioned, it has 280 watt-hours of capacity. It sits on the down tube in combination with the bottle cage, which comes with the Levo Gen 4. It basically clicks in at the bottom, and you can twist it in like this, and you'll also see a third mounting hole right on the down tube. A special screw goes in there, which acts like an anchor, allowing you to click the range extender into place so that it sits completely secure in the frame. Then it's connected to the charging port using a special cable that also clicks firmly into place at both ends. What's special is that you can also ride the bike using only the range extender, but that means you'll be riding with reduced power. Specialized says it's about 50% of the maximum output. So essentially you'll be riding with about half the power. But if, for example, you want to save weight, then that's an option. As for the weights of the other two batteries, I didn't reweigh them, so I rely on the specifications provided by Specialized. The 600 watt-hour battery weighs in at about 3.2 kilos and the range extender at roughly 1.6 kilos. There's one more thing I find important to mention about the batteries, namely the discharge behavior when used in combination with the range extender. Because up until now, with the SL models that already had range extenders, you could configure the discharge behavior of the batteries. That's no longer the case here. So you can't adjust that yourself anymore, and both batteries always discharge in parallel. That is, unless the two batteries are at a different state of charge, in that case, they are brought to the same power level first. So that might lead to a situation where you attach your fully charged range extender during a ride. Maybe because you didn't think you might need it when you've started your tour, but put it in your backpack just to be safe. If that's the case, the range extender will be discharged first to the level of the main battery. Only after that, they will be discharged in parallel. In practice, that means that you'll be riding with reduced power for a while, even though you still have the main battery installed, because at first the range extender is discharged on its own until it has the same level as the main battery. Definitely something you should be aware of if you're considering using the range extender. I'd say just always connect it right from the start, just to be safe. That way you won't end up in that situation in the first place. All right, let's wrap up the topic of batteries and the range extender for now and move on to the chargers or charging in general. Now things are going to get really interesting. The new Specialized 3.1 system offers two different chargers. A standard charger with 5 amps and a so-called smart charger. Both operate at a record-breaking charging voltage of 59 volts. The latter, the smart charger, goes up to 12 amps of charging current, so it offers over 700 watts of power output. Just for comparison, the Avinox charger, which is rightfully praised for being very fast, has a charging power of around 500 watts. That means Specialized's new smart charger is quite a bit faster in terms of charging time when you use it in fast charging mode. From 0 to 50% takes you just 40 minutes, 80% of the battery in about 1 hour. And if you want to charge it to 100%, it takes a bit longer because the charging current decreases. That's being done to not put too much stress onto the cells in the battery. Those numbers are mind-boggling. Right now, there's no way to charge an e-bike faster than with the smart charger from Specialized. However, that amount of power doesn't come without its trade-offs. Yeah, it's not small. And I'm telling you, this thing is really heavy. It weighs over 2 kilos and has an aluminum casing. And it's only included with the S-Works model, Otherwise, it's an accessory you'll have to purchase separately, and it costs a whopping €4.99. You really have to think hard whether that's worth it for you, especially as the standard charger is pretty fast too, as I will show you in a second. However, the smart charger has one more trick up its sleeve. It's something I've been asking for a long time. Namely, you have a button here, and with this button, you can set the charging behavior directly on the charger. You don't need an app or anything at all for it, and the charger ultimately has 4 settings that you can cycle through using the button. You have the standard charging mode, which charges at 5 amps. You have the mentioned fast charging at 12 amps. You have an eco charging mode with 3 amps if you got the time. And you can also directly limit the charging level to 80% with a simple press of a button. That's actually really, really cool and very nicely implemented, and I like it a lot. Although, of course, you have to admit that a fast charger especially makes sense, I think, when you're on the go. Put it in your backpack and charge during lunch at a restaurant, for example. And sure, the chunky smart charger might fit in a backpack, but it's anything but convenient to take with you, both regarding its size and its weight. So let's look at the standard charger instead, which isn't as standard as you might think. For that, we need to dive a bit deeper into the technicalities of charging, voltage, and so on. The standard charger may have only 5 amps, that's true. And unfortunately, I haven't actually had it in my hands yet, but I did find the dimensions in the user manual. It's supposed to be even smaller than this one from Bosch. So it's pretty compact, and you won't have any issues fitting it in your backpack. And yes, like I said, it's only 5 amps, but it also charges at the same 59 volts as the smart charger. That means you get significantly higher charging power than other chargers with 4 or 5 amps. And honestly, I wasn't really aware of all this in such detail until now. I've just been looking into it here. And ultimately, it's really the charging power that matters. That's why in future videos, we're going to move away from talking about 4 amp, 12 amp, or 6 amp chargers. But it makes much more sense to talk about charging power from now on. To illustrate this for you, the 5 amp charger from Specialized, due to its nearly 60 volt charging voltage, it charges the battery in 3 hours and 45 minutes, according to Specialized. That's almost twice as fast as the Bosch charger, which is also rated at 4 amps but operates at a much lower voltage. Next point, display and control unit. The new Mastermind T3 display is integrated into the top tube and is noticeably larger than the display on the previous model. At a square 2.2 inches, it's still fairly compact, really colorful, and easily bright enough to be easy to read. Even in sunlight, I never had any issues with it. It's not a touch screen, which some people might have expected at such a price point. Honestly, I don't really miss it, but that's a matter of personal preference. You could see it either way. The remote has been redesigned as well. The most controversial thing might be that Specialized decided against a wireless connection and went old school with a cable. Personally, I think there are advantages to using a wired connection. For example, something that has occasionally annoyed me with Bosch's mini remote is that it sometimes has a slight delay when you want to quickly change something and it's somehow in sleep mode. I don't know what causes it specifically. Sometimes it just takes half a second before the input reaches the drive system. You will certainly not have that issue here. And you don't have to worry about the battery in the remote itself because it's powered by the system. In return, of course, you have one more cable. Like I said, there's pros and cons. I can understand why they did it this way, but I can also understand those of you who say, I would have preferred it to be wireless. The remote itself has 2 buttons and a joystick. You have 1 button at the top, 1 at the bottom, and a joystick in the middle, which you can also press and move to the right and left. I actually had to get used to the new remote for quite a while because you have a button at the top and bottom, but you don't use those to set the support level. Instead, you adjust that by moving the joystick up and down. And if you're like me, coming from another bike or riding many other bikes where it's usually the case that you adjust the support level using the 2 buttons at the top and bottom, then at first things often go wrong and you press the wrong button. Once you've ridden the bike for a bit, it gets better. That was the case for me. Once I had been out for a bit, it didn't bother me anymore. However, I do find it generally a bit fiddlier to adjust the support level using the joystick compared to just having simple buttons you can always press, but that too is probably a matter of taste. The remote itself is good, the pressure points are solid, it's slightly rubberized so you don't slip off and so on. It's unobtrusive, which I personally like. As I said, opinions will probably be divided when it comes to the controls. The joystick with its many functions, right, left, up, and down, is important precisely because it allows you to adjust almost everything directly on the bike that you could also configure in the app. That means you can adjust all the motor settings. We'll get to customization in a moment. You can set the shuttle mode, the responsiveness, all of that can be configured directly on the bike as well. So you don't need your smartphone for that. You can do it directly via the remote. And that's probably why Specialized had to figure out how to fit all of that into a small control unit. And in the end, they managed to do it quite well. Next, let's talk briefly about the wiring on the inside of the bike and specifically what kind of accessories you can connect to it. I took some time to read through the user manual for the Levo Gen 4. I was pleasantly surprised to find that you can easily connect a front light. You don't even need to plug anything into the motor for that. Instead, there's a small splitter. You simply plug it into a wire stored in the top tube. For that, you can remove the display without any tools. It comes right out. It's a neat design. Beneath, you have access to all the cables and can connect a splitter there, and that provides a connection for the light. It supplies 12 volts and 24 watts. The only downside is that you can't control the light directly from the bike. That means as soon as the system is on, there's always power running to it. So you'll need a switch on the light itself to turn it on or off. Let's finally get to the practical part, riding performance and noise levels. We'll start with the sound for now because that's probably what many of you have been waiting for. Well, I have both good news and bad news for you. Let's maybe start with the bad news. Unfortunately, the new Specialized 3.1 motor isn't as quiet as its predecessor, which was it was the absolute benchmark in terms of low noise at a high performance. The new one doesn't quite reach that level. But the good news is it's still very quiet. I'd place it roughly on the same level as the new Bosch CX Gen 5. Depending on the scenario, it might even be a bit quieter at times. So, especially when you're riding up a road at a relaxed pace on asphalt, it's almost inaudible. However, when it really has to work hard, like on a steep climb and you're pedaling at a higher cadence, then in my opinion, it's a bit louder than the Bosch. What was especially important to Specialized, something they really focused on, and I can actually confirm this, is that the motor maintains the same noise level regardless of how warm it gets. And I've brought this up in the past, especially with Bosch motors, most notably with the Bosch SX, the light motor, which in my opinion is quite extreme, going from virtually silent when cold to anything but silent once it's warm. That's not the case at all with the Specialized 3.1. It stays exactly the same. So it's just as loud or quiet when cold as it is when hot. Going downhill, I actually only have good news because the motor doesn't rattle at all. Nothing. Zero. Nada. It's completely silent. The bike itself, however, is only 95% silent. From the tonality of the noise, I can assure you that it wasn't caused by the motor, even though I cannot 100% say what the cause of the sound was, especially because it just happened sometimes. I can't tell whether it was something with the battery or maybe the cables up in the head tube area. So now finally, let's talk about the ride quality, which isn't exactly unimportant, arguably the most important thing about all of this, despite all the theory. So how does it ride? How does it feel? Does it still have that Specialized feeling to it? Well, I would argue, yes, it actually still does. However, that has two different sides to it, I would say. So on the one hand, I'll just say it right up front, for me, for my riding style, for what I ultimately want from an e-mountain bike, I think it's currently the best motor. Or, well, I should probably say it suited me best and I enjoyed riding the most. This might not be true for all riders, though. Because even in the higher support levels, it's more gentle when you start pedaling. It doesn't have the punch of a DJI Avinox. It's a bit smoother when putting your foot down, and sometimes for me, this is really the only thing I might criticize. It takes about half a second too long to respond. As I said, you can adjust that in the app via the acceleration settings, but I find that it quickly becomes rather unruly. So I think having that initial punch while still keeping it controllable, that's the one thing I feel other drive systems might handle a tiny bit better. But in practice, it honestly never really bothered me. But I did notice it at the beginning because the motor does deliver the power when you need it and you're already riding. And in that regard, in my opinion, it's very similar to the feel of the previous motor as well. Because the Specialized 2.2 also doesn't have this ultra punch when putting pressure on your pedal, but is very smooth. And at the same time, excellently controllable. And that's still exactly the case here. It's a great and very harmonious motor with excellent modulation, even in difficult terrain conditions, when it's slippery, when you're already struggling on the trail, when you're tackling challenging uphills. Really, really smooth. All that while still offering a substantial amount of peak power when you absolutely need it. And for me, like I briefly hinted at earlier, perhaps the best thing, the biggest feature of this motor is the way the overrun is tuned. The way the overrun works here, it's made a big difference to my riding on the new Levo. Just to quickly explain overrun. Ultimately, it's about how the motor behaves when you stop pedaling. Pretty much all modern current EMTB motors and drive systems continue to push for a brief moment after you stop pedaling. On the one hand, this is meant to provide a so-called more natural riding feel, even though technically it's not natural at all. But the idea is to prevent you from falling into a dead spot on a steep climb the moment you stop pedaling. Instead, it allows you to fade out gently and maintain control while reorienting yourself. At the same time, it's also meant to help when you're riding up a technical section. If you briefly can't or don't want to pedal, or for whatever reason you stop pedaling, then the drive system is supposed to kick in for a short moment to bridge that gap for you. And in my opinion, no other drive system does that as well as the new Specialized 3.1 motor. There's this well-known saying in the EMTB world, especially when climbing technical terrain, don't stop pedaling, keep pedaling no matter what your mind is telling you. This is especially true in difficult uphill sections, super steep ones. Often it's your mind telling you, I have to stop now, I can't ride up there, I'm going to tip over or something. And so you stop pedaling, and that's exactly when the motor kicks in for you. And not in a way that catches you off guard or makes you think, oh no, please stop, but it does it just right. It goes on very gently. The push keeps you going and then fades out just as smoothly. I've already said this in various bike tests again and again. I'm not the ultimate uphill, technical uphill king. I'm not losing any sleep over admitting that. And this drive system really helped me a lot, especially in situations where I struggled on the trail both physically and mentally. The first thing that usually happens is that I stop pedaling. That's when the drive, as I said, really reminded me, gave a little push and was like, see, it works. And then I just kept pedaling. And that was a real aha moment for me. I know there's a lot of talk about overrun right now, but it was never that obvious to me like with the new Specialized motor. It's not like it made me ride up crazy rock steps or anything like that, as I simply lacked the skills to do that. Rather, for me, it was the combination of a natural, smooth riding feel in really difficult uphill terrain, and also that little bit extra, which maybe helped to partially compensate for my lack of skill and mental blocks. For me, it helped me tackle some uphill sections I never thought possible and made me enjoy the ride in such terrain a lot more than I thought I would. It's hard to convey, hard to explain to you, and maybe also hard for you to experience yourselves. For that, you really have to take the bike up some technical uphill sections, and then I'm sure you'll feel it. And so, I've actually reached the end of today's feature presentation on the Specialized 3.1. I hope I was able to give you pretty much all the information you need, especially if you're considering a purchase. And as I said, for me, the overall package is currently the best on the market. I am aware that this is highly subjective, and I deliberately say as an overall package, because the motor is neither the lightest nor the most powerful. The batteries don't have the highest energy density on the market. And the motor also isn't the quietest. So when it comes to top marks, the drive system can't achieve them in any category. But the overall package, which includes things like chargers, connectivity, and especially riding feel, is what really matters. All the more reason I'm interested in what you think. Do you agree with the decisions Specialized has made? Some of those decisions are definitely controversial, you could say. Do you think they made the right call? Did you expect more? Drop it in the comments. Otherwise, we'd really appreciate a like and subscribe to the channel. We put a lot of effort in these tests, so we'd appreciate it. Enjoy the start of the season, the first warm days. Get out on your bike, and then we'll see each other again very soon. Take care and see you soon. Bye-bye.